Good morning. Let me join Fred in welcoming you all here. We're glad you've taken the time to come. We think we've got a great program for you. It falls to me to have the great privilege of introducing President Ilves of Estonia. Let me tell you briefly about him. He was born in 1953 in an Estonian family living in Stockholm, Sweden. He was educated in the United States, first at Columbia University, and then a master's degree in psychology at the University of Pennsylvania. In 1981 to 1984, he lived and worked in the fields in arts and letters in Vancouver, Canada. In 1984, he moved to Europe to work at the office of Radio Free Europe in Munich, Germany. From 1993 to 1996, he served in Washington as Estonia's ambassador to the United States and Canada. And in 1996, he became foreign minister and served until 2002. From 2002 to 2004, he was a member of the Estonian Parliament. From 2004 to 2006, a member of the European Parliament, and since 2006, President of the Republic of Estonia. He is widely published in several languages, and he's widely read, more to the point. And I can think he is truly a citizen of the Western world, and I can think of no one better to begin our conference this morning. President Ilves.
Thank you. Is this working? What's working? Something working. It's all working. Well, thank you very much. It's a quarter of a century ago. Has it really been that long? The world order that we had known for 50 years, the status quo of the preceding half-century was shifting and about to collapse. The world, at least from our perspective then, was bipolar, consisting of liberal democracy with market economies found mainly in the West, versus illiberal autocracy combined with collective ownership, also known as communism, mainly in the East. Of course, just to keep things in perspective, most of the world was too poor to be considered part of either, whence the now rarely used term Third World. This neat, or at least simplistic, order was beginning to crumble and would soon collapse. The first semi-democratic election in the communist world in Poland 25 years ago was a milestone in what we thought was an irreversible, and thought at the time, felt to be an irreversible march to liberty. Indeed, we should recognize how miraculous that election was. With the deck clearly stacked in favor of the communists, with censorship still in place, Solidarity won 99 out of 100 seats in the Senate, showing what the Polish people thought of communism. Also in that year, another milestone, I would argue, an American, then at the State Department's policy planning staff, Francis Fukuyama, published what must be considered one of the seminal essays of the late 20th century, The End of History, later expanded into a book of the same name, arguing that the ideological debate between liberal democracy and authoritarian communism was over, that liberal democracy had won. Fukuyama, it is important to note, did not say liberal democracy had won in the real world or that everyone had embraced democracy, a criticism often leveled at him, and I think that's a straw man criticism, but rather that the contest for ideas was over, that no one could any longer make claims for the superiority of an authoritarian regime. At that time, the Soviet Union had yet to collapse. Its days were numbered, and when it did, we took it as more proof of Fukuyama's Hegelian view of history and the victory of liberal democracy. Today, 80% of Russians support annexation through military aggression in Crimea, where the Anschluss of territory is justified by the presence of co-ethnics. Moreover, there is widespread support for an anti-liberal attack against permissiveness, in quotes, be it in freedom of speech or choice of life partners. Indeed, we see that liberal democracy has not only failed in the battle of ideas against authoritarianism, but it has even failed to prevent the resurrection of that once vanquished demon, fascism. Moreover, it is resurgent not only in Russia, where a generation has grown up since the end of communist rule, but even in what we thought bastions of liberal democracy in Western Europe, which should know well the demons of fascism and the ideologies of hatred. These same ideas are gaining new currency. Not in Ukraine, though, where the two neo-fascist candidates on 25 May received 1% each, as opposed to the results we saw in many countries in the European parliamentary elections the same day. What went wrong? Why is it that today everything seems more insecure than even in the Cold War, when at least we had agreed upon rules of international behavior regarding what countries may or may not do? The main answer is that the rules no longer apply. What was agreed to and generally followed even at the height of the Cold War today lies shattered. Part of the answer lies in another essay that later became a best-selling book, too, Samuel Huntington's The Clash of Civilization, that appeared 4 years after Fukuyama. Huntington saw future conflicts in the post-ideological age to be ones between cultures and civilizations, which also seemed to be verified by the 9/11 attacks, motivated as they were by a religion-based antipathy toward modernity. And soon enough, we were challenged on our own ground, in empirical reality, not political science theory. In New York, in Washington, and mass attacks in Madrid, London, and Bombay. All challenged the liberal order, attacking inter alia democratic elections, the equality of men and women, the separation of church and state, the rule of laws, not men or God. Until recently, it seemed that this was a revolt against modernity, true, against the disruptions of globalized capitalism. We thought, though, that on our own continent, the wars of the 20th century, the defeat of Nazism, and the collapse of communism had settled, as Fukuyama maintained, once and for all, the primacy and Hegelian ineluctability of the triumph of liberal democracy. Indeed, we thought then, and some former chancellors still do, that democracy in Russia reigned supreme. As we have seen, it hadn't. Ideas such as territorial annexation based on co-ethnics abroad, which we saw last in 1938 with the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia and the Anschluss of the Sudetenland and Austria, ideas we believed were settled for good on May 8, 1945, had not been. But that's the oldest rule that is now null and void. There's the prohibition of aggression that came into effect with the UN Charter, also from 1945, stating that members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or the use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. The next foundation of security to fall were the Helsinki Accords from 1975, in which the transatlantic countries from Vancouver to Vladivostok agreed not to use force to change borders or challenge the independence of any state. I'm quoting here, to regard one another's frontiers inviolable and to refrain from making each other's territory the object of military occupation. No such occupation or acquisition, according to the Accords, would be recognized as legal. And then there's the 1990 Charter of CSCE, Charter Paris for a New Europe, in which the signatories of all the then members, including newly free Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary, as well as Russia's legal predecessor, the USSR, agreed, and I quote, to fully recognize the freedom of states to choose their own security arrangements. I just quote that to recall the argument made to justify both the attacks on Georgia in 2008 as well as what's going on in Ukraine. All these agreements were done in the liberal spirit of Immanuel Kant's Perpetual Peace from 1795. For aside from the internal market, the intellectual foundations of the European Union as well as of NATO ultimately rest on Immanuel Kant's essay. Kant believed in what has 2 centuries later become our dominant foreign policy mantra. Republics, that is today, in our terminology, democratic states based on the rule of law, who form a federation, do not wage war on each other. The European Union has, since its origins in the coal and steel community in 1951, amply proved Kant's thinking to be correct. Where we went wrong, though, was that we believed the agreements of 1945 to the present, the ones I just enumerated, the UN Charter, the CSC agreements, also constituted a Kantian federation. They did not, and the communities of liberal democracies have not solved what to do with countries outside a federation of democracies. By and large, we have extrapolated from Kant and the experiences of the EU to come to believe that tied to a lattice work of agreements, countries will not engage in aggression, forgetting that in the case of the UN, the CSE, the OSCE, and numerous other lesser treaties, that Kant was right, but offered no solutions on how to get along with despotisms and tyrannies. Ladies and gentlemen, thus today we find ourselves in a completely new security environment. It is not, I repeat, it is not a new Cold War, because the Cold War had those agreements. We're back in a Hobbesian state of nature. And on top of that, we are abandoning the principle for the prospect of enrichment. In this radically new situation, the liberal democratic West is still looking for answers, or failing to agree on what those might be. We still do not know how to react. What we must realize, however, is that once the rules of the Helsinki Accords and others no longer hold in relation to one signatory, the situation has changed for all of us. This is not an East European issue. Ukraine is not a faraway country we know nothing about, to quote Neville Chamberlain when he agreed Adolf Hitler to dismember Czechoslovakia in Munich in 1938. As I said, I speak of these conundra because the liberal order is being challenged by authoritarian, illiberal, yet often successful market economies in ways we did not foresee when the first free elections were held in Poland 25 years ago. I would argue that if we are to look for an analogous era, we can rather find it in a pre-Cold War period, in say 1946 or 47, feeling around to figure out what we should do. We feel instinctively, as we did then, or the previous generation did, that we are in a new era. We want desperately to believe in the old coalitions and hang on to them in the hope that all this will go away, that Crimea will be restored, that we don't have to go on with sanctions or raise defense expenditures, that we can go on making money with our deals and our financial institutions and our lucrative trade in everything from gas to building Spetsnaz training centers in Russia. Like the plaintive teenager who asks, why can't we all just get along? I can't resist here and not quote Lenin, who immortally said, the capitalists will sell us the rope with which we will hang them, unquote. Not being stupid, we know that things are going awry, but maybe we can still make one more deal, build one more pipeline, sell one more bit of military hardware before we have to stop. And maybe the European election results are one-off and the right-wing populists, the Jobbiks, the National Fronts, and others will become reasonable when they take office. And maybe we can convince Russia that homophobia, censorship, and repressions at home, and little green men, and taking OSCE observers hostage, and accusing the Ukrainians of fascism was all a big mistake. that we wake up from a bad dream and restore the status quo ante at the end of history. But, ladies and gentlemen, peace, love, and Woodstock is over. We've just had our Altamont. And if you got that last sentence, you're about to enter, if not already have entered, retirement. So I enter on this melancholy hope, but this was to be a scene setter, and hope that with the judicious guidance of a vibrant, fiercely democratic Poland, the only large European country with a living memory of what authoritarian rule, what communist rule is about, that we can come together and together find a way out of this Hobbesian world we find ourselves in today, Anno Domini 2014. Thank you.
Mr. President, thank you. Terrific speech, and exactly what we needed to set the scene for our conference today. I agree with almost everything you said, but in my questions, I'm going to argue a bit from the other side and give you a bit the counter-argument and see how you respond. It may be that we've returned to a Hobbesian state. I want to talk a little bit, though, the dialogue and debate within Europe, and particularly in the wake of the European parliamentary elections. In some sense, is this a decline of the liberal democratic order, or are we a victim of our own principles, which of course allows people to organize whether on the political right or the political left? So it's not a watershed, but in some sense a status quo that we are going to live with in some sense because of our own liberal democratic principles. And what's really missing in Europe, and I would say in some sense as in the West as a whole, is the vigorous defense of that liberal democratic order, the vigorous defense of the decisions Europe has made over the last 40 years in terms of the European project. That's really the piece that is missing here in the current debate in Europe.
Well, yes, there is a complete and utter lack of both a vigorous defense of liberal democracy coupled with a justification of profits at all costs, or let's not do anything if it affects our own economic well-being, which we see today, especially regarding things such as sanctions. And I would say that it is really a failure of leadership, and an insistence on basically profit over principle. As I said, there are all these terrible things happening. We don't like them, but well, we wouldn't want to lose another deal here. Maybe we can sell something else. I mean, that's the justification that's brought by too many people, some more explicitly, in some cases less, other people less explicitly. But I would say ultimately it comes down to a failure of leadership is a cliche already, but rather a fear of actually taking a stand on issues. And certainly I would say that in many cases here in this part of the world, be it Poland or Estonia or other countries under communism, this kind of, people who are faced with kind of a patronizing arrogance from the West, saying, "Oh, you people, you have your sort of post-traumatic stress syndrome. We understand, good little East Europeans. We'll pat you on the head. You'll get to be like us someday." I mean, I've seen this happen. I mean, when Estonia, after 2008, took a rather vigorous stand on what was happening in Georgia, we were dismissed by our northern neighbors as just suffering from post-Soviet traumatic stress syndrome. I would say much of what I said today about the agreements no longer holding, in fact, was true already in 2008, and we let it slide. only, I would argue, encouraging that kind of behavior. So, so when East Europeans feel that they're going to be, that they can't really, or Central Europeans can't say really what they think is going on because they're going to be branded as being kind of funny, then you let the other people get away with it. I think Jonathan Ayal in the Financial Times about a month ago, it said it quite explicitly. For 25 years, we've been saying that the East Europeans are paranoid and that Russia is just a normal country and you should treat them as such and get over your hang-ups. And now it turns out they were right. But this sort of Cassandra-like we told you so experience is not too wonderful, because if you know your Homer, you know that Cassandra died.
I want to try to avoid that last lugubrious note, but ask you this question. In 2008, when Russia went into Georgia, a number of us were saying the risk here is today Georgia, tomorrow the Ukraine, and the day after the Baltic states. Well, fast forward 2014, you know, Putin is, quote, maybe 2/3 of the way there, which raises this question as president of Estonia. How worried are you about Estonia's own security, and how ready are we, particularly in NATO, to deal with the kind of destabilization, subversion approach that President Putin is adopting in Ukraine?
Well, I would say, I mean, that argument largely comes from the fact that we, like Ukraine, have a Russian minority. And so, since everyone always fights the last war, so that's the first thing that comes to mind. In Estonia, we have two cities. We have the capital, which I call Medina, and then for journalists, and then we have Mecca, which is Narva, where every journalist in the world makes a Hajj to Medina as soon as there's some kind of problems to see what the Russians think there. It actually works very nicely because there's a river separating Russia from Estonia, and it sort of curves, and you can sit in Estonia and you can take this wonderful picture that completely sort of captures, I mean, for journalists, the Huntingtonian divide. On the one side, you have a huge fortress built by Ivan the Terrible in sort of Tatar style, and then on the other side, from this point, you see this rather Lutheran-looking fortress built by Karl XII of Sweden, and you see east and west facing off, and then they go, and I mean, this is, I don't know if Michael Kaminsky was supposed to be at this conference, but anyway, all these journalists, among the rest, all go and say, what do you think of Crimea? And everyone says, this is largely Russian, yes, it was right to do. And then the next question, well, what do you think about here? No. And I mean, you think about it, you're a Russian living in Narva, and you have euros. Across the river is a plunging ruble. You have free movement of labor and all of the other things in Europe, and the other side, you would have free movement of labor to Kamchatka. I mean, it's not really, you know, it's not really encouraging. Why would someone want to do that? In fact, and the other statistic was, I mean, if in the take-home pay of a miner in the Donbass, but it's like more or less like that in Russia as well, it's about 200 euros a month. The take-home pay of a miner in Estonia is 2,000 euros a month. Not bad. So, I mean, I don't think that's not an issue. And the opinion polls show this paradox. 80% almost support the annexation of Crimea by Russia. And basically 97% never want to be part of Russia themselves. So it's not, I mean, so I think that it is a case of, I mean, this persistence on looking for analogies. Okay, it happened in Crimea, it's going to happen there next, is overdone. On the other hand, there's no reason why you can't do it some other way with, I mean, you know, we see, what did we see last year? In complete and utter violation of the Vienna rules, where you're required to have observers if any military exercise takes over 13,000 troops. There were 70,000 troops that practiced attacking and occupying Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland. I mean, And it's a biannual exercise called Zapad, and last year's Zapad basically practiced invading us. I mean, they're not defensive. So it doesn't have to be the little green men. It can be big green men.
We, I think, are moving now to the security panel, so hopefully that will be shortly, and that will be one of the first issues of discussion there. We are unfortunately out of time. Mr. President, thank you very much for getting us off to a great start this morning.